Right, morning all. Welcome to Client Network Operating Systems for the second semester. The name is Kincaid. I'll be taking you for this particular module for the entirety of the semester. So I think it's imperative for us to just understand exactly what's happening as far as this particular module here is concerned. It's largely a practical module, and you'll discover that most of the content or most of the acumen that you covered in the computer architecture module is distinctively revisited as far as this particular module here is concerned. But I think focus is more on the Windows operating system. I think most of you might want to ask why Windows, why not Linux, why not Mac, and so on. But I guess the argument there is Windows is one of the most widely used operating systems out there. And in essence, I mean, once you know how to use and maneuver one particular operating system, you've literally undertaken them all. So we're going to look at obviously the basic overview, understanding exactly what's happening with assessments, and then delve into what's happening as far as the first particular chapter of the prescribed textbook. And obviously, just again, like I said before, you'll discover that most of the content, just slightly revisiting what's happening with computer architecture. But again, like I said before, I think more often than not, the focus is distinctively on the Windows 10 operating system, just to familiarize yourself in terms of what's happening when it comes to functionality of this particular OS. So we're going to look at basic overview in terms of what's happening as far as this particular module here is concerned. Let me see if I can quickly share my screen here. All right, there we go. Okay, so the prescribed textbook for this particular module is your Microsoft Specialist Guide to MS Windows 10, and obviously the author there is your B. Wright and Plesniowski. As far as the actual particular text there would go, I'm sure you've gotten these particular textbooks already. If not, it's also available on EBSCOhost. So just look through your student guide in terms of that particular link that will enable you to actually access content when it comes to this prescribed textbook. And just to make sure that we're all on the same page there, that is the actual cover associated with the textbook itself. So just make sure that you've got the right particular text to enable you to obviously make sure that we move in accordance with module content as far as this particular setup there is concerned. So your Microsoft Specialist Guide to MS Windows 10, configuring Windows devices, and like I was saying earlier on, Byron Wright and Leon Plesniowski is the distinctive or are the distinctive authors as far as this particular textbook there is concerned. And then when you look at assessments, I think you're all familiar with what is happening as far as assessments across the modules there is concerned. We've got an ICE component, your integrated curriculum engagement. There's a minimum of 4 tasks, and that contributes 10%. I think you're already familiar with that content, like I mentioned a couple of seconds ago. But for the purposes of ensuring that you at least get the better mark rather associated with that configuration there, most of the research-based questions or most of the tasks that I'll give you during the course of our lectures will literally constitute ICE components there. And again, obviously, the more ICE tasks that you undertake, the better it is in terms of you getting a better mark as far as that particular 10% allocation there is concerned. So I think it's imperative for you to make sure that any of the tasks or any of the research-based content that I dish out associated with our lectures there, you ensure that you complete accordingly, because those would obviously contribute to the ICE component there. And then when you look at the basic formatives, you've got your test, which constitutes 25%, and the assignment is 30. I think your PAS should be up on your portals. If not, it's obviously on its way. Just make sure you diarize the dates accordingly, just to make sure that we don't miss out in terms of submission of these assignments, as well as obviously writing the tests accordingly. So just ensure that, especially when it comes to the assignment, try and avoid submitting on the actual a date that is due. They give you these dates in advance for a reason, for you to actually prepare and complete accordingly. I do advocate for you to at least complete these particular assignments a week or so before they're due, so that if there are any discrepancies, obviously you avoid the whole issue of having to rush to submit, and obviously the bottlenecks that I experienced on the VC Learn platform in certain instances. Why? Because you obviously need to have that safe assign report generated accordingly. Normally it takes between 24 to 48 hours, but obviously, if everyone is submitting at the same time, you get certain issues in that regard. So at least a week or so before is applicable. And should you need me to go through or for pointers, or to go through drafts of these particular assessments, feel free to pop me a mail. I'll obviously incorporate all that content towards the end of the session as well, just to ensure that we're all on the same page there. So you've got about 7 learning units associated with this distinctive module. When you're looking at the test, learning unit 1 to 4 is what is literally applicable. And because it's certificate level, obviously the questioning is in accordance to the actual certification or qualification at hand. So you'll normally get your multiple choice based questions. You normally get match columns. You obviously have a certain questions that would delve within the missing words. True, false in certain instances. Hasn't been there for a while though, but you will obviously, or rather, you should literally be prepared in that regard. In certain instances, you'll need to identify whether a specific statement is true or false. If it's false, you obviously need to state the reason why, or you need to correct it in certain instances. And then you'll obviously have scenario-based questions. So what's happening with those? You're given a bit of a background in terms of what's happening with the specific issue, for argument's sake, and then you're asked to answer a set of questions that are in accordance to that specific scenario that you'd have been distinctively given. Normally, you find those in section B of your section 2 of your particular papers, both exam and test included. And naturally would carry bigger mark allocation in that regard. So it's obviously important for you to identify and understand exactly what's happening in that regard. So it's a largely practical module, like I was saying right at the beginning. But at the end of the day, when you're writing, it's not a practical assessment per se. You will need to distinctively look at coming in to write an exam, or depending on the situation in the country, probably have a take-home exam as well. But it's imperative for you to be able now to link practical to theory and vice versa. But I think for the assignment, if I'm not mistaken, that is obviously going to be a practical-based assignment. If there's any changes, obviously the campus would give you a heads up in that regard, where you'll obviously need to install an operating system. Like I said before, some of this you've already done in computer architecture, but the only difference now is that you'll be looking at specifics in terms of configuration as far as the actual operating system platform there is concerned. So I think when it comes to the practical part, you'll need to run this within the virtualized environment. So you can either use Hyper-V or VirtualBox. as distinctive virtualized platforms that you can use in order for you to complete the assessment accordingly, and obviously to assist with you understanding module content at large. And I think it's also imperative for you to understand that you need to have the right machine as well. I think this has already been discussed, especially when you're looking at network architecture as well during the course of this semester. I think your tutor or lecturer there would obviously give you a heads up in that regard. But it's imperative for you to have a machine that has a processor that can accommodate for virtualization. And then at the same time, when it comes to your RAM component, at least work with a machine with 8 gigs of RAM, just to ensure that we've got enough to accommodate for that virtualized environment. And then when it comes to actual storage, SSDs are normally your default go-tos, but traditional hard drives still work in that regard. And then at least 100 gigs as typical storage that you want to work with. And then when it comes to the exam, 35%, that's normally a 2-hour exam, 120 marks, and obviously that's closed book. So that's also going to be a theory-based assessment in that regard. So from an assessment point of view, this is what you're distinctively looking at. You've got your ICE, you've got your test, you've got your assignment and examination. Pass mark is naturally 50%. Should you not hit the 50 and you're between 40 and 48 as far as your overall mark is concerned, then you do distinctively qualify for a supplementary exam. But obviously, when it comes to the subs, you're capped at 50% when it comes to mark allocation in that regard. Should you be below those marks, then unfortunately, that means you fail the module. You'll need to repeat or redo that module as far as content would go. So like we've mentioned before, I think, like I said right at the beginning, that most of your tutors right at the beginning of the year mentioned that if you're going to be using this particular certificate as a platform or qualification that gets you into the degree program, then I think it's only one particular module that you can literally carry over. So it's important for you to make sure that at least we try and pass all modules to avoid any discrepancies in that regard. So that's your assessment at large. And then when you're looking at the basic module purpose, like we've mentioned earlier on, it's all to do with just understanding what's happening with the OSs. Obviously, remember, when you look at client, it means that you also have a server environments. And like I said before, from your computer architecture content, the client is normally your generic machine that is getting services from a dedicated computer system within your network environment, which is obviously your service. You've got dedicated roles in that regard. Your client is responsible for your generic users within your network environment in most instances, and they would get services from your dedicated machines, which are your servers. And normally these services would include email, print, applications, the list will go on and on. So your Windows 10 is a typical example of a client operating system that is obviously installed within your network environments, or even standalone configurations, although those are distinctively very rare environments there. Most of these machines now are connected to some type of network. So you've got the whole concept of just ensuring that you understand how that particular OS functions, what particular features are associated with it, how to configure it, how to function it within the network, and obviously what it does in terms of users within your specific environment there. So you've got about 4 distinctive module outcomes there. Again, like we said before, installation, configuration, being able to troubleshoot, because I think at the end of the day, the whole concept of understanding what's happening with machines at large, or computer systems at large, is dwelling within the whole environment of you being able to troubleshoot, which is naturally being able to find an actual problem or identify a problem and be able to fix it accordingly or resolve it accordingly. So troubleshooting is part and parcel of what's going to be happening as far as this particular module there is concerned, or content at large. Again, looking at security as well. If you look at especially the module outcome number 4 there, it's very difficult for you to discuss, again, anything to do with ICT without delving into security at large in that regard. So Learning Unit 1, just a basic introduction, which is obviously what we're going to be looking at in a couple of minutes there. Just looking at what's happening with the Windows 10 platform, what it offers, what it's all about, understanding some of the different terminologies and what they distinctively mean as far as your systems would go. And then when you look at Learning Unit 2, again, the whole concept of just understanding what's happening with your file systems or your disk environments. Like I said again, I think I'm beginning to sound like a broken record, but within computer architecture, you also delved into the different file systems that exist. So FAT, NTFS, what's the distinctive difference between the two? Which one is the most appropriate to use, or which one is the current platform, and how it functions within your configurations there. And then obviously the security features we were talking about earlier on, just ensuring that you understand from a user perspective how you can incorporate specific security features, what they do, what they mean, how they affect user experiences, and overall configuration at large there. Networking, again, I think you'll discover that everything is literally interrelated, because you also have a network architecture module. You've got a cybersecurity module as well. So most of that content is literally going to be interrelated, and it makes it a lot easier for you to at least to understand specific content at large there. So understanding what an actual network is, how to configure it when you're using client network operating systems, and then also identifying what's happening with the IPs, what is happening with configuration of these IP addresses, and the different terms that you also find within your networking environment there. So that's Learning Unit number 4. And then when you look at 5, part and parcel of the whole concept of you troubleshooting, maintaining your operating system is also looking at optimization. Right. So what can you incorporate that enables your operating system to function to the best of its capabilities for the best user experience for the individual or the individuals that are obviously going to be using it. So just understanding exactly what you can do to enhance performance. Also looking at the whole concept of fault tolerance. You want to ensure that if anything does go wrong with your system, you've got a backed up platform in terms of the actual image of the machine at large, or user files and basic data or content. And then the penultimate learning unit number 6, delving into virtualization. Again, it's something that you touched on in computer architecture, but we'll be looking at it in a bit more detail in this particular module, and again with your network architecture as well, where you look at you've got a host, which is the actual physical machine, and then you've got a virtualized platform where you're literally running a machine within another machine. What are the different software packages that are there? What are the architectures involved at large? How can you configure those, and what does it do in terms of both user experience, with looking at the whole concept of how these particular architectures can also be used in the corporate environment, and what it means from a hardware, a resource perspective as well. So Hyper-V is your default go-to when you look at it from a Windows perspective. Like I said before, you also have third-party virtualization packages. VirtualBox obviously being your default go-to there. All provide one and the same. I think preference is just in accordance to what you're comfortable with, what works, and so on. But ultimately, these particular virtualization platforms provide one and the same thing. And then obviously the last learning unit is going to be enterprise computing, looking at remote support, how you can literally look at configuring and being able to assist and work with troubleshooting at large, again, within remote localities. So instead of you having to be physically present in a specific environment, as long as there's some kind of connection, some kind of link, normally over the internet, you literally can be able to assist within remote platforms there. So that's your module at large. Very basic content, really. Like I said before, again, most of the content is going to be revisited. Just a few concepts that are slightly more specific to the actual operating system at large there, but it's literally one and the same in that regard. All right, so that's that. Let's see if we can create notes as we go along in terms of the actual module at large. And then obviously discussing, like I said before, the introduction, just understanding what's happening with the operating system at large in that regard there. So when we've mentioned this before, I think most of today's session really revisiting certain content, but again, also introducing new. So it's imperative for you to just look at it from a broader perspective in that regard. So if you look at the whole concept of a computer system, right? We all know that a machine or a computer is any electronic calculating device, right? Which means that your computer system can range from your basic pocket calculator to the most sophisticated machine that you can imagine. And I think it's imperative for us to remember that when you look at your computer, you've got a subdivision, or it's literally made up of two distinctive components, right? One abstract, one physical, or one physical, one non-physical, whichever way you want to look at it. The physical part of your machine is obviously known as your hardware, things that you can see, feel, and touch. And then the abstract or non-physical part of your machine is known as your software. The two are interrelated, which means that one can literally not exist without the other. So you can have the most sophisticated software out there, but if you don't have the hardware to function it, that software is null and void. And again, the reverse is true. You can have the most sophisticated hardware out there, but without the appropriate software to literally manipulate those hardware components or function those hardware components, then ultimately that particular hardware is also distinctively null and void. So when you look at the whole concept of your software, right? Like we mentioned before, software, abstract part or non-physical part of your machine. These are all programs or executable code that are used to manipulate or function hardware or physical components as far as your machine would go. So this software is subdivided into two main parts as well, right? So you've got what is known as system software, and then you also have app, right? Or application software. And your system software is literally the most important software that is necessary for a machine to function. So all machines, all computer systems out there will need to have an operating system for basic functionality. But the moment you want to use your machine for a specific purpose, then you have to load the appropriate application package to do that. So your application packages just enable us to use your machine for a specific purpose. So if you want to work with computer-aided design, you naturally have to add in or install computer-aided design software. If you want to work with a word processor, same difference applies. But in order for you to work with or install application packages, system software needs to be incorporated first. So your system software literally lays the foundation for everything. And again, with that system software from content that you're already familiar with, is subdivided into what they call firmware. And you also have what is known as the OS. So you've got firmware, which is normally associated with the term BIOS or basic input-output system or services. These are normally programs as well that are distinctively designed to enable the central processing unit to talk to hardware devices or to understand what's happening with hardware devices. So at a basic level, every hardware component that is out there needs to have some semblance of firmware or BIOS incorporated in order for them to function as such. Because remember, when you plug in a mouse to your system unit, for instance, you expect that particular device to function as a mouse. What are you talking about? We're looking at double clicking on an icon, obviously maneuvering within the actual machine itself. Same difference would go with the keyboard. When you hit the letter A on the keyboard, you expect the letter A to be displayed on screen. But before that happens, a minimal set of code obviously needs to be incorporated on that device. So every particular keyboard out there will have a semblance of BIOS incorporated that enables that keyboard to function as a keyboard when it's plugged into your system unit, for instance, right? So that's what firmware is all about. But then on the other hand, you have your operating system. So your OS's main purpose now is that basic functionality of your machine for for basic user experience. So in essence, when you look at your OS, if you want to look at it from a different perspective, your OS or operating system would have three main functions, if you want to look at it from a different point of view. So when you look at your OS, so let's mention the function of your operating system here. So let's say function of your OS. So if you look at the operating system, the actual function of this particular OS would firstly be the whole concept of managing computer resources, right? So this looks at management or managing computer resources. And what are we talking about as far as these resources are concerned? Your generic central processing unit, memory when it comes to usage of the machine. You're also looking at secondary storage. These are all examples of the resources that we're looking at as far as your machine there is concerned. So like I mentioned before, this could be your CPU. We can discuss your memory, which is obviously your RAM. You can also even discuss secondary storage here, right, or your disks. So here we can say secondary storage as well as typical examples. And then the other thing that you want to also look at as far as your particular operating system there is concerned is the user interface, right? So just availing for a user interface. I think this is one of the most important ones if you want to look at it from a different point of view, because remember, if we don't have this interface, which is literally a go-between between user and machine and vice versa, the user does not understand the capabilities of the machine, and at the same time, the machine does not understand what the user wants it or what wants it to do. So this user interface is important in terms of just availing for engagement between the user and the machine itself. So here we can mention providing a user interface. And remember, as far as this interface here is concerned, it can either be the graphical user interface, command line, or menu driven, or hybrid, if you want to look at it from a different point of view. And naturally, choice is ultimately dependent on comfortability of use, but obviously the most common type of user interface that you find out there is obviously going to be your graphical user interface. So typical examples would include GUI. You can talk about command based, less user-friendly, but ultimately uses less resources. If you're clued within that environment, naturally default go-tos. But again, if you don't know a specific command, or if you don't know the syntax or the grammar associated with the command, then functioning a machine within this environment becomes a bit more difficult. And then you can also discuss things like menu-driven interfaces at large. So you we can list this as hybrid if you want to look at it from a different point of view. So here we can also even mention, remember when something is hybrid is literally a combination of, so we can also even mention hybrid type of interfaces or the menu-driven platforms we were talking about earlier on, but that would still literally fall within that particular category there. And then the other thing that you also want to discuss as far as your particular OS there is concerned is literally providing services for application software, right? So that's one of so here providing services for your application software, right? Application software. So those are the three main functions. Remember, main doesn't necessarily mean only. These are just when the moment we mention main, we're literally just looking at focusing on what is distinctively relevant in that regard. So these are the three main functions of any distinctive operating system that you'd find at large there. Right. So when it comes to different distinctive examples of these OSs, right, the different types of OSs that exist, you can discuss a Linux as a typical type of OS. You can mention Android. Again, probably that's a bit of a repetition because developed on the Linux platform. You can talk about Windows, one of the most common types of OSs that are out there. And then you can also even discuss Mac as typical examples of the different types of OSs that distinctively exist. So our focus, as far as this particular module is concerned, is obviously going to be on the Windows-based platform. So I think it's imperative for us to understand that our focus is literally going to be on the Windows configuration there. Again, like I mentioned before, the reason being most common that you'll find, and again, like I said right at the beginning, the moment you know how to function Windows, for argument's sake, you shouldn't have distinctive difficulty in working with Linux, for instance, or working with Mac. Yes, the interfaces could be different here and there. Underlying architecture is literally one and the same at the end of the day. So there's your distinctive examples that you'd find as far as these particular OSs they are concerned. So when it comes to Windows, it's a particular operating system that was developed about 35 years back. It's 35 years old because I think this was back in 85 when the first version of Windows was designed. Now we've got the 10th version, literally not a 10th per se, but we've got Windows 10 incorporated as a typical example of the graduation from the first type of operating system that was initially developed working within your command-based environment, and then moved on to GUI, and then obviously a lot of other nitty-gritties were added in just to make that particular operating system applicable in that regard. So what's imperative for us to understand, especially when it comes to Windows 10, is the different versions that are there, all right? So it's also important for us to understand that there's a distinctive difference depending on the literature that you use between what they call a version and an edition. So more often than not, a version is the different types, if you want to look at it from a different point of view, of Windows that exist within that Windows 10 environment. And then an edition is normally associated with underlying architecture. So is it a 32-bit or a 64-bit? Sometimes you might find that certain literatures might interchange those two terms in terms of configuration. Remember, the whole concept is if it's a 32-bit system, you're obviously limited in the amount of RAM that you can use. Again, like I said before, this is content that you're familiar with already. And if it's a 32-bit system, obviously you are limited to 4 gigs of RAM, because the 32 bits we're talking about is discussing the actual address bus that links the central processing unit to your RAM, right? So the wider the bus, the more instruction sets that can be sent and received, and ultimately the faster that your machine would be. So 32 bits or a 32-bit system would limit you to 4 gigs of RAM. A 64-bit system, on the other hand, enables you to use much more than 4 gigs of RAM. On paper, about 16 exabytes, but obviously you've got limitations in terms of your motherboards, the onboard electronics, the actual configuration of softwares and hardwares that are out there. But at least that gives you an idea of the amount of RAM that can be plugged in, or the amount of accessible RAM that is there, because you've got a wider bus associated with your configurations in that regard. So those that is normally associated with like I mentioned before, the addition, and then you've got the different versions, which are obviously the different types of operating systems within that Windows 10 configuration that you've got. So normally these you can upgrade from one particular version to the other, but some obviously argue that it's literally cumbersome for you to actually upgrade from a 32-bit to a 64-bit without what they call running a clean install. We're going to be discussing those different installation formats, obviously, in our second session. Or in chapter 2, as far as this particular module content there would go. But again, like I said before, it's something that you obviously would have done at a specific point in time. So when you look at your Windows version, so here we'll mention Windows 10 versions. Sure that this is legible, Windows 10 versions. So you've got 4 mainstream versions associated with your Windows 10, right? These 4 mainstream versions would include Home. You also have what they call Professional. You will have Enterprise. And then you'll have Education. All right. So these are your 4 mainstream versions, right? You will also encounter mobile and Windows 10 N and K editions as basic additional versions that are there, but these are more specialized as far as your setups there are concerned. So obviously, choices in terms of which particular Windows you go with, in terms of the actual features applicable, and obviously what it offers and actual user experience associated with your specific setup there. So these, like I mentioned before, mainstream. Mainstream. There you go. And then obviously you have the additional platforms that are there. So specialized versions that you'd find. Specialized versions would include mobile. And obviously, as the name would say, developed specifically for your distinctive mobile platforms there. And then you will also have Windows 10 N versions. Normally, you'll find that with the N version configurations, you'll discover that these particular operating systems are normally bundled with your media software. So your Windows Media Player as a typical example. So in certain instances, you find that this particular setup is looking at it's a specific version of Windows that doesn't include these bundled media platforms for certain countries that literally do not allow for that when it comes to your configuration, where they would want to use third-party media players as far as your specific platforms there would go. So these N versions are normally released or sold in countries that do not allow for Microsoft to obviously bundle your media player configurations or any other media software that is there as part and parcel of the OS. And then, so this is obviously part and parcel of fair competition. So instead of remember, when you've got something that's already bundled, there's no need for you to look at third party in most instances. So it's all about trying to ensure a fair competition, if you want to look at it from a different point of view. And then you will also have the K version. So you've got N and K versions. And obviously, K is only sold in South Korea. All right, so K only sold in South Korea, and again, just as with N, some features are obviously removed. Windows Player as a typical example in that regard. So those are your four mainstream versions as far as Windows 10 there is concerned. So the actual differences, again, like I was mentioning a couple of seconds back, is just looking at user experience. What are the features? What is typically offered as far as these particular setups would go? You'll discover that if you go back to this particular slide here, your enterprise versions is normally sold or literally works with customers who purchase what they call software assurance. And what this enables is all about automatically receiving latest versions of this particular software package. And normally you find that with your enterprise and education platforms, you deal with what they call volume licenses. And literally, remember, when you look at installation of any software package, to legitimize that installation, you normally need to incorporate or you buy a license, right? So it's normally one license per machine or one license per installation of any particular software that you've got. But obviously, the moment you look at medium and large scale environments, it might become a bit of an issue, obviously from an economic point of view, and obviously from that whole issue of installation point of view, where you need to literally have one license for 50 machines, for instance, for 100 machines, for instance. So instead, you buy what is known as a volume license that will obviously accommodate for those 50 or 100 machines, or whichever number that you got in that regard. That's the reason why I was mentioning a medium to naturally large scale setups as far as your specific configurations would go. And obviously, with your Windows education, literally the same as enterprise, but obviously without what they call the long-term servicing branch platform there. So I think let's have a quick look in terms of what's happening as far as the different the features of these specific versions, just to understand exactly what's happening in that regard. So our first one, so here we can just mention that we want to look at the actual features. So the first one that we want to look at there is your Windows 10 home, right? As far as your basic feature configurations there would go. And let me see if I can quickly add in content here accordingly. So Windows 10 home here. All right. Hopefully that is legible. Let's see. All right. So let's. So that's our Windows 10 configuration there. As far as the actual basic features there are concerned, hopefully that's a bit legible. Probably let's blow this up a bit. Or literally maybe move it to a different slide, right? Right, let's move that to a different slide so that at least it is legible. Okay, so there we go. So let's see if we can actually blow this up a bit. Alrighty. Right, so these are the generic features associated with your Windows 10 home platform. So you've got fast startup, you've got 32-bit and 64-bit versions, your battery saver, all the way down to your easy upgrade from home to professional edition. So these are just the generic features that you find as far as your Windows 10 home configuration there is concerned. I think one of the other things that you'll find also quite interesting there is Continuum, which what actually happens as far as this particular configuration there would go is that your Continuum here is a feature that has been developed that enables the whole experience of your Windows to adjust a device's interface to accommodate different factors. So what this would typically mean is if you're going to be working with Windows on a desktop, the actual experience that you get there, the actual interface that is provided for, some of the features that are there are literally different if you want to look at it from a different point of view. If you're going to be using that same Windows on a tablet, for argument's sake, or a touch-enabled device, or on a mobile platform. So it's all about the whole concept of just a device's user interface to obviously accommodate for those different features associated with your distinctive environment as far as your platforms would go. And then when it comes to your professional, so here if we mention professional there, so normally when you look at graduation or the whole concept of the different versions that are there, if you look at professional, for instance, it will have everything that Home has with additional features. So it's always important for you to understand that when you look at the graduation from Home to professional, enterprise, education, and so on, all you're looking at as far as feature configuration would go is you've got your features for Home. The moment you move to professional, all the features for Home that we've just looked at a couple of seconds ago are included in professional, but ultimately you now have additional features that are distinctively incorporated there as far as your particular setup would go. And these particular features would obviously include what is currently on screen as we speak. So we've got something along these lines. Again, let's see if we can blow that up accordingly. So again, as you can see there, we've got 64-bit version that literally supports up to 2048 gigs of RAM. Like I was mentioning earlier on, what you're looking at is a wider address bus. And in all actuality, like I said before, on paper, you've got up to about 16 exabytes of a RAM that is there, but obviously you've got limitations in terms of the actual software and the hardware components that are incorporated. But all it means is that the moment you want to use anything more than the 4 gig limitation associated with 32-bit versions, literally your 64-bit is your distinctive go-to as far as configurations they would go. So being able to join a domain is not applicable when you're working with Windows 10 Home. I think this is one of the other things that you also need to take into consideration when it comes to your assignment, when it also even comes to your network architecture configurations there, that if you're going to be working with the client side of your operating systems, it's imperative for you to at least work with Windows 10 Professional. Why? Because you now have features that enable you to join domains, enable you to function content accordingly. And as you can see, like we were mentioning earlier on, that whole concept of working with the Hyper-V or your virtualized platform in that regard, also within your VirtualBox environments, especially when you want to then have your server link up to your client and vice versa, it's applicable for you to ensure that you work with Windows 10 Professional, just to make sure that we're all on the same page there. So earlier on, I was mentioning having a machine that obviously enables or accommodates for virtualization. We talked about the 8 gigs of RAM as a minimum, the SSD, and then traditional configuration there, naturally with at least 100 gigs of storage space that you can literally play around with or use. But again, when it comes to the actual function of the actual OS itself, your professional is the preferred OS, just to obviously avoid any discrepancies that are there. It also introduces such architecture as your BitLocker, and remember, encryption is part and parcel of securing your configuration. Should your drive get lost, or should your computer system get lost, stolen, or otherwise, what you're actually looking at your data being encrypted to avoid it being accessed illegally or in an unauthorized fashion, if you want to look at it from a different point of view. So that's what your BitLocker literally enables you to take into consideration. Again, that remote desktop we were talking about earlier on, and then with the encryption services that I was just mentioning a couple of seconds ago, one of the main additional features that you find there, and obviously the whole concept of being able to join a domain and then being able to use that much amount of RAM as far as your specific setups they are concerned. I think it's you might have already looked at the whole concept of the calculations associated with the whole configuration of your RAM architectures, why there's that particular limitation in that regard. But if not, maybe I can look at a quick revisit here just to make sure, again, we're all on the same page here. So if you look at what we were mentioning earlier on in terms of the whole concept of 32-bit versus 64-bit, with a 32-bit architecture, remember when it's the moment we discuss 32-bit, remember your bit. The term bit is short for binary digit. So it means that we're looking at 32 ones and zeros, 32 on states if it's a one, off states or off state rather if it's a zero. Remember, from an electronic point of view, a zero represents your circuit being off or an off state, like I was mentioning a couple of seconds ago. A one represents a significant state or an on state. So with the 32-bit configuration, if you're looking at it from a mathematical point of view now, it means that the totality associated with this, when you convert your bits or your binary digits or your binary numbering system to decimal, it means that the total number of configurations we've got, obviously from a byte configuration, there is 2 to the power 32, and obviously what this converts to, if you're looking at it from a mathematical point of view, if you got your calculator is ready there, you can run the calculations with me. I think this gives you 4,294,167,296. So these are the actual byte configurations that you've got there. So if you look at it we'll look at it just now from a calculation point of view. So what this does now, in terms of calculations, remember we've mentioned before that you've got maybe if we park this for 2 seconds, you've got your bit, all right, which is either a 0 or a 1, and then 8 of these bits equate to 1 byte, right? So when you look at it from a calculation perspective, you've got your bytes that then graduate into kilobytes, into mega, giga, all the way to your zettabyte configurations as far as your setup there is concerned. I think yottabytes rather would be your current maximum as far as this particular configurations would go. So what you're looking at now is that normally your kilo is associated with 1,000, right? But to be more specific, the closest we've got there is 2 to the power 10, which gives you the 1024. So normally you'll find that instead of the basic 1,000, your 1024 is your default go-to. So what we mean by that is that if you've got 1024 of these bytes, you've got 1 kilobyte. All right, 1 kilobyte. There you go. What's happening with my stylus now? And then 1024 of these kilobytes. Remember, there's a difference between capital B and a small letter b. If it's a capital B, that's your bytes. If it's a small letter b, that's your bits. So that then equates to 1 megabyte. Right, and then 1024, the list will go on and on, right? 1024 of these megabytes would then equate to 1 gigabyte and so on. So if you look at if you look at the mathematics, right? What we had initially have in this particular slide here is that is the four your 4.2 billion bytes associated with your particular setup. So as far as these bytes would go, it means that if you want to get the kilobyte configuration, we have to divide that number by the 1024 to get your kilobytes. Then we have to divide that number again by 1024 to get our megabytes, and then you obviously have to divide that number again by 1024 to get your gigabytes. So if we were to open up our calculator quickly, where is my calculator here? So let me see if I can quickly share this. So there's our calculator there, right? So remember what we've mentioned before, that as far as calculations would go, we've got a 2 to the power 32 setup. Remember, we're talking about 32-bit environment. So we've got our 2 to the power 32, like we mentioned before, gives us that, right? And then the first, if we divide that by 1024, that will give us the kilobytes. Then it will give us the megabytes and then the gigabytes, right? So if we were to divide this particular number by the 1024, the first 1024, that will give us, this is the number of kilobytes that are there. If we divide that by 1024, that's the number of megabytes associated with your RAM configuration there. And then, or your address bus, if you want to look at it from a different point of view, if we divide that again by 1024, it gives us the 4. So this is the reason why a 32-bit system is limited to 4 gigs of RAM. You can only access 4 gigs of RAM with 32-bit. Yes, you can plug in more, but then you can only access or use 4 gigs of RAM in that regard. And then obviously, if you want to go back with the 64-bit, like I was saying earlier on, it's your 64-bit configuration is obviously within your 16 exabyte configurations there. And and if you want to look at it from a different point of view, again, if you want to look at it from a calculation, let's see if we can quickly go back to our slides here for you to exactly see why there's that particular graduation. So here. All right. So, like we mentioned before, if we expand this, right? So we've got 1024 here, 1024 of these GBs will equate to 1 terabyte. And then if you graduate from 1024 of these TBs, you get 1 petabyte. And then 1024 of these PBs will equate to 1 exabyte. And then 1024 of these exabytes will equate to 1 zeta. And then obviously 1024 of these zettabytes would equate to 1 yottabyte, right? So if you look at the 64-bit configurations, we're talking about the exabyte configurations, right? So the moment we're discussing giga, it's 1, 2, 3 times that you divide by 1024. But if you're then looking at exabytes, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then a 6 there to get your configurations that is there. So if you go back to our calculator quickly. if we were to go and look at a 64-bit version. So this we're just discussing a 32-bit version. So the 64-bit version, obviously, the amount of bytes that we've got there is that, right? So if we were to divide that by the 1024, like we were mentioning earlier on, so if we're going to go 1024, that's our first 1024. And then we've got our second 1024. Then we've got our third 1024. Oopsie, it's 1024, right? And then we got our fourth 1024. Then we got our fifth 1024. Sorry, 1024, right? Enter. And then we've got our sixth 1024. That gives you 16. All right, so this is the 16 exabytes that we've got associated with the 64-bit version. Right. So again, this is on paper, but as you've seen, with the maximum of your the maximum of the actual Windows Professional there is only up to 2048 gigs that you can literally plug in there as far as your particular system is concerned, because of limitations in terms of electronics and so on, as far as your particular setup there is concerned. All right, so that's literally that. Again, like I said, it's just revisiting some of the content that you already are familiar with in terms of understanding what's happening in that regard. So we've got professional with those particular setups, and then the other version that you've got is distinctively enterprise. Right. And then as far as enterprise there is concerned, when it comes to the features, everything that Windows Professional has, plus additions. So this, when you look at Windows Enterprise, what you're actually looking at in terms of configuration is these distinctive features here. So let's see if we can blow this up so that it's a bit legible. So these are the actual additional features that you find, especially when discussing the whole concept of enterprise. And remember, like I mentioned earlier on, enterprise, you're literally dealing with volume licenses. This is when you're looking at medium to large enterprises. You've got direct access, and you've got a bit of a short explanation in terms of what these particular features are all about. Direct access, the whole concept of remote access as far as your mobile computing configurations are naturally outside the localities of a local area network using internet configurations there. Then you've got App Locker, which is all to do with reduction of the effects of malware, all the way down to long-term servicing branch there, which obviously avoids the requirement of an update when obviously you're looking at a specialized and secure environment. This is the main difference that you find between enterprise and edition. When you discuss, and education rather, when you're looking at Windows education, what you've got there now is that this particular feature is now absent in that particular edition. So enterprise and education are one and the same. The only difference is that your long-term servicing branch there is the one that you've got that is not included when it comes to your Windows education as far as your specific platforms would go. So obviously this is Windows installations that you'd use within an educational environment or setup, much like you'd have on campus as far as your computer rooms there distinctively are concerned in that regard. And then naturally, when you're discussing Windows 10 mobile, ultimately, remember, you're now looking at your mobile gadgets, your smartphones and tablets in certain environments. But arguably, you will discover that obviously the user experience on a mobile platform is different from your generic desktop. So normally you'd find scenarios where, from a programming perspective, developers would need to then develop an actual operating system that functions on these particular environments. But Remember, what you want to avoid is to develop an OS in accordance to the actual platform itself, as opposed to you developing an OS in accordance to the actual device. So instead of having an operating system that is developed specifically within the mobile platform, what you're actually looking at is the actual gadget itself as far as your configurations would go. So with your Windows 10 mobile, it now introduces, or your Windows 10 mobile, now introduces what is called WUP, and this is short for Universal. I think I'm missing an R there. Windows platform. And what this particularly does is it allows developers to code applications that target device families as opposed to a single operating system, right? So your UWP's main purpose is allowing your particular developers to code applications that target the actual device or family of devices. So it's a smartphone, a tablet, a two-in-one machine, for argument's sake, as opposed to the actual a single operating system as far as your configuration platforms there are concerned. So I think that does that in terms of the actual versions of Windows that literally exist. I think it's important from your own professional and personal environments just to understand what the differences are, what are the features involved as far as your specific setups there are concerned, and obviously in which environments these particular versions would distinctively be used in. And then again, I think it's important for you to understand what's happening with your user interfaces. So remember, we've mentioned that an interface is literally just a go between when you're looking at your machine and the actual user itself. The better the interface, obviously, the better the user experience. And then again, if you're looking at it from configurations point of view, like we were mentioning earlier on, if you're looking at something that is not user friendly, it obviously makes the whole concept of the user experience a bit of a cumbersome process. So the things that you might want to focus on when you're looking at your interfaces there, from an introductory point of view, is naturally discussing your lock screen. Normally, this deals with security. You'll need to incorporate a username and a password, but naturally, normally passwords, if you're looking at it from single account configurations, but obviously the moment you're looking at it from a domain perspective or multiple accounts, you obviously need to incorporate these electronic credentials, which is your username and your password, to obviously gain access to the actual system at large. And then you've got your generic start menu that you obviously also need to familiarize yourself with. And what's happening as far as that particular platform would literally go is just looking at being able to access content that is distinctively installed as far as your machine mechanisms would go. What you'd also want to take into consideration as well is your search interface as well. So that particular search bar that enables you to distinctively find content that is within the local computer system or on the web, as far as information would go. The other thing that you also want to look at is your taskbar, notification area, and your advanced window management platforms that you'd also want to take into consideration. I think from a representative point of view, let's see if we can, this is again, like I said before, content that you're familiar with, just to make sure we're on the same page there. That's a typical example of what a distinctive lock screen would look like as far as your specific environment platforms there would go. What's happening here? Let's see if we can resize this accordingly. Okay, there we go. So that's your lock screen as far as your specific setups would go. And then when you're discussing the whole concept of your start menu, again, content that you are also familiar with, that's a typical example of what your start menu, let's see if we can blow this up a bit. That's what your generic start menu would distinctively look like. And then when you want to discuss the whole concept of your search interface, you got something along those lines. Again, like we were mentioning earlier on, just a platform that enables you to obviously search for information on your local machine and obviously on the web as well. What's happening with us trying to resize this thing? Okay, I guess it's still legible in that regard. And then obviously also, if you want to look at it from a taskbar configuration, something that you're also familiar with, or wanted to add this on that second one here. All right, so that's generic. Taskbar is the one that you find all the way at the bottom that will naturally have. So this here, it would be your taskbar, the one that you find all the way at the bottom there. Let's see if we can quickly elaborate it accordingly. So that is this entire thing here is your taskbar. So we're all familiar with what's happening there. And then when it comes to the notification area, what you're literally looking at in that regard is this particular part here. So that's your notification area. So that's your notification area there. All right, and then like we mentioned before, so that's your taskbar. Right, so that's I think that you already are familiar with, like I mentioned before, as far as configurations there would go. I think one of the other things as well that you'd want to familiarize yourself with in terms of content. Let's see if we can add a couple more slides here. Right, I think these should be enough for the rest. Right, so the other thing that you also want to discuss is your system hardware support. So obviously the whole concept of your processors, understanding exactly the different types of configurations that are there, literally support of hardware in that regard in terms of what your actual operating system distinctively provides for as far as your configurations there are concerned. So one of the other things that you also want to discuss in this regard is what they call system. I think let's change our font or our color there. So a system hardware support. So what you're normally discussing in this regard is processor support, and the generic term, especially when you're now looking at it from these particular OSs. So if you're discussing processor support, right, the generic term is normally central processing unit, but that's a bit of a obsolete term, especially when you're discussing the whole concept of your operating systems in this regard, because the whole concept of the central processing unit is now literally known as SoC, which is short for system on a chip. All right. So this is short for system on a chip. Okay, what's happening with our stylus? Yeah. Okay, there we go. All right, and then what's in that regard? this system on a chip is configuration now that combines a CPU together with other supporting hardware on one silicon chip. So the SoC or system on a chip, all you're discussing here is a combination of the CPU together with other supporting hardware that obviously are incorporated on one silicon chip. And what are these supporting hardwares? We're discussing your GPU, for instance. So these integrated graphics cards. Again, when you were discussing processors and computer architecture, you looked at this. And then also your IMC, your integrated memory controller chips. Remember those specific architectures that are responsible for ensuring that the correct instruction is collected from RAM and naturally sent to your a CPU. Is part and parcel or works within the whole address bus configuration, and then power management. So the support that we're looking at from an SoC point of view, as far as support hardware would go, is your GPUs, your IMCs or integrated memory controllers. You can also even discuss your power management platforms there, management. All right, so that's what your SoC is all about. So obviously in that regard, you can discuss multi-processor support, hyper-threading. I think we also remember what a thread is all about. A thread is just the same thing as a piece of an instruction. And at the moment you're looking at hyper-threading, you're looking at these multiple threads or pieces of instructions being executed simultaneously, and also looking at multi-core support in that regard. So file systems, obviously, like we said before, going to be discussed in a different a session that is obviously dedicated specifically as far as that particular setup there is concerned. So what you also want to discuss is a legacy app support. So remember, anything that is legacy within, when the moment we discuss ICT, anything that is legacy configured is old architecture. So the moment you talk about any legacy architecture or legacy configurations, legacy support, legacy applications, legacy hardware, these are older type of applications or hardware platforms that are there. But again, remember, when you graduate, or these particular operating systems, when they upgraded from one particular version to the other, or one particular OS at large, so the movement from 8.1 to 10, for instance, or the movement from 7 to 8.1, or from 7 to 8, normally you'll find that there'll be certain applications that might not function accordingly on the new operating system. So to accommodate for that, you've got compatibility settings that are there, or legacy app support that is incorporated, which obviously enables these particular applications to function or to be emulated so that they function as if they're working on a Windows 7 platform when you're actually working on Windows 10 or Windows 8.1 platform when you're actually working on Windows 10, just for argument's sake. So when you're looking at these legacy support, so this is legacy app support. What you can look at in this particular concept is compatibility settings. Compatibility settings. And what we mean by that is literally an emulation of an environment for an application based on an older operating system. That's what this is all about. So the actual settings that you're looking at in this particular regard would literally include your Windows 95, 98, also Millennium. You can discuss XP, Service Pack 1 and 2. We can look at Vista, again, with Service Pack 1 and 2 there. And then you can discuss 7 and 8 as your typical setups there. So when you're looking at legacy support, what this typically means is that if you're running Windows 10, for argument's sake, you've got certain applications that are not functioning accordingly as far as your Windows 10 platform is concerned, you can run an emulator that is obviously inbuilt. This is what compatibility settings are all about, that enable that same application to run as if it's running on a Windows 95 platform, as if it's running on a Windows Vista platform, as if it's running on Windows 7, or as if it's running on Windows 8. So this is all to do with making sure that you support old types of apps that might not have been developed accordingly for your a newer operating system. And then you can also discuss what they call compatibility troubleshooter. So this is just checking whether a specific app is compatible with the new operating system there. Alternatively, what you can also do is that if it doesn't run with your compatibility settings, or if your compatibility troubleshooter indicates that this particular app won't run even with emulation, you can then run it in a virtualized environment. So you can install, like we were saying, another machine within your machine, and then run your app in that distinctive environment. And obviously, this is where your Hyper-V comes into play there. So this is where your client Hyper-V, oopsie, let's see if we can write this accordingly. Hyper-V configuration comes into the foray. So this is just a virtualization platform that just enables a usage in that regard. So that's with legacy support. And then I think the other thing that you also want to take into consideration is connectivity apps. So just making sure that you understand the difference between remote desktop, remote connection, or remote assistance, and then your generic home group. So this is also something that you want to take into consideration as well. So this falls under connectivity apps. And in this regard, you're looking at remote desktop. So this is something that you also want to ensure that you familiarize yourself with. Let's see if we write this accordingly. Remote desktop. And this is obviously available within Pro, Enterprise, and Education versions. And what you're looking at in this particular instance is just a remote connection to a computer that enables a user to actually sign in and run apps. That's what a remote desktop is all about. There's a difference between that and then remote assistance. So this here is a platform that just enables the standalone app, literally, that just obviously enables you to solicit the help of a trusted professional over a network. You can contact or enable communication or configuration via email, file transfer, or an easy connect service, just for them to assist you with a certain issue that you might be experiencing as far as your specific setup is concerned. So there's a difference there, because your remote desktop just enables an actual user to log in and run certain apps as if they're actually sitting in front of that machine. And then on the other hand, your remote assistance is you obviously soliciting assistance from a trusted professional to assist you with any issues that you might obviously that you're encountering at that particular point in time. And then you obviously would discuss your home groups. So these just enable easy sharing of content, like your music, your videos, your documents, also sharing of devices such as your printers. That's what your home groups are all about within this particular setup and environment. And then the last thing that you also want to discuss is your networking models. So again, this could be content that you're also discussing in network architecture as well, and the different types that you'll encounter as far as your Windows configurations there are concerned would include a work group. And obviously, this is literally just the whole concept of peer-to-peer networking. Remember, when it's peer-to-peer, it means that every machine that is connected literally does not have a distinctive role. So it's for, again, easy sharing of content and access within your configuration. So traditionally known as a peer-to-peer environment, which enables you to share content accordingly. Every machine within that environment does not have a distinct role, as opposed to a client server configuration, which is distinctively incorporated within a domain infrastructure. And remember, when you're looking at your domain configuration, this is now a collection of computers and users that are obviously identified by a common security database. And more often than not, you've got a specific or dedicated machine that is responsible for ensuring that services are incorporated accordingly within this environment. And this is where you discuss such architectures like your DC, which is short for domain controller. And naturally, the actual domain controller that you're looking at in a Windows-based platform is Active Directory. So normally this is associated with a DC. And like I mentioned before, your DC is short for domain controller. And then obviously, when you're looking at it from a Windows point of view, your actual DC is associated with AD, which is short for Active Directory. All right, so this is just a Windows version of your domain controller, which obviously looks at management of users, user and computer accounts, and obviously looking at just central management of configurations there as far as your specific setup is concerned. I think one of the other things as well, from a cloud-based perspective, is Azure. So normally the moment you look at Azure Active Directory joined there, now you're discussing cloud-based architectures. So this is just associated with cloud-based environments there as far as your service configurations would go. So directory service that is hosted as a cloud-based service, obviously over the internet. And then I think the last thing is peer-to-peer networking. This is the same thing as a work group. The only difference is, so here you've got what they call Windows. Let's make sure this is legible. Windows peer-to-peer peer-to-peer networking. Right, so this is more or less the same as your work group. The only difference now is that, remember, your work group is limited. Your traditional work group is limited to physical space. So you actually have to be within the same physical space in order for you to literally access the functionality of it. So a local area network is a typical example within a specific environment where you've got connection through your routers or your switches that obviously enable these particular devices to communicate accordingly within a specific localized environment. Now, the moment you discuss Windows peer-to-peer architectures now, you're now removing the limits of this physical demarcation by now scaling your LAN to the internet. So this is just looking at the whole concept of scaling your LAN in infrastructure to the actual internet perspective. There you go, as far as your specific setup is concerned. So here, what you can actually mention is that you're just scaling your LAN. Remember, LAN is short for local area network to the actual internet. So it's the same thing as your generic work group. The only difference now is that instead of being limited by the physical confines of your environment, naturally you can now scale it to the internet space as far as your configurations there would go. So I think that does that for our introductory part. What I would want you to do as far as basic research there would go, let's take this back to our oopsie. Right. So as far as research is concerned, I'd want you to look at the review questions. Review questions on page 31 of your prescribed textbook. All right. Review questions on page 31 of your prescribed textbook. That would literally just give you added understanding in terms of what's happening as far as content there is concerned. All right, so let me see if I can quickly unmute individuals that might want to ask questions. Feel free to type or use the chat section there should you have any questions that you need to have attended to while I look at all right. Feel free to ask questions should you need to. Any questions, contributions, or concerns from anyone on the floor there? Feel free to use the chat platform as well, should you need to. Do you have any questions, contributions, and or concerns from anyone? Contributions or concerns from anyone? Questions, contributions, and concerns. Your mics are available for use, should need to be, or you can use the chat section. Do you have any questions, contributions, and or concerns from anyone on the floor? Okay, so I think that does that. I think what else? I think the other thing as well is recorded session. So naturally, going to be uploading it onto the YouTube channel. And then let me see if I can quickly add in a new slide here. So as far as the actual see text box here. So email address is 17675@ieconnect.co.za. So should you need to pop me a mail, you can take that into consideration. And then as far as the link to the YouTube channel is concerned, I'll be uploading this probably a little later on today, but I'll give you a heads up in that regard. Every which way you can always check. The YouTube channel is www.youtube. I got that right. Right, so that's the actual, oopsie, that's the link to the YouTube channel. So that's the email address there, should you need to pop me any questions or pop me an email. And then the actual YouTube channel is that there. Let's see if we can put this slightly wider so everyone can see. Okay, cool. So email address and then YouTube channel that will be uploading our recorded sessions should you need to go through that content again at a later stage. Right. Okay, so it seems that we don't have any questions, contributions, or any concerns from the floor. So I think it's best we call it a day. I think our next session, if I'm not mistaken, it should be sometime next week. Where's my timetable now? Yeah, should be sometime next week, I'm guessing. Should there be any changes, obviously, we'll communicate accordingly. But otherwise, thanks for attending. Stay safe, keep smiling. We'll see you in the next session. Cheers.